On Saturday, 40,000 Palestinians demonstrated to mark the one-year anniversary of the first Great March of Return demonstrations at the border separating Israel from Gaza. At least 189 Palestinians were killed by Israel's military. On Saturday, 40,000 Palestinians demonstrated to mark the one-year anniversary of the first Great March of Return demonstrations at the border fence separating Israel from Gaza. At least 189 Palestinians were killed by Israel's military last year when taking part in these weekly protests which demand that Israel respect Palestinian refugees' right to return to their ancestral homes. On Saturday, 4 Palestinian protesters, 3 of them teenage boys, were killed by Israeli troops. 300 Palestinians were injured. This, of course, all takes place in the context of the longest running occupation in modern history. Israel have occupied Palestinian territory since 1967. That's over 50 years or half a century. In this episode of Tiski Sour, my guests will discuss the current situation in Gaza and the West Bank. But I also want to focus on politics within Israel itself. That's because next week, Israelis will take part in general elections. Israel presents itself on the global stage as the only democracy in the Middle East. But to what extent do elections in an occupying country matter to those who it occupies? To answer this question and more, I'm joined by Salma Karmi-Ayyoub, human rights barrister and campaigner for Palestinian rights, and Yair Wallach, who is Professor of Israeli Studies at SOAS. So we'll get on to Israeli politics in a moment. But first of all, I want to get our audience up to date with what's going on in Gaza. So Salma, how should our audience understand the Great March of Return?
So, well, I think a bit of background. This is a weekly protest of Gazans who walk up towards the fence that separates Gaza from Israel. And it started a year ago. So the first protest was 30th of March 2018. And the idea of the march is to highlight, raise awareness about Palestinians' right to return to ancestral homes, which are now in modern-day Israel, because 80% of Gazans are actually refugees or descendants of refugees. And the other thing about the marches, which I think is important to note, is it's essentially a civil society initiative. So there's a committee that organises the marches that has representatives from all sectors of society, women's groups, trade unions, political parties, and they have a unifying principle, which is the marches are meant to be peaceable and unarmed, and they largely are. So that's a march that's been happening every week. And as you said in your introduction, Israel's response has been to station snipers at the Israel-Gaza fence, and it's been documented in a recent UN report that live fire has been used unlawfully against unarmed civilians. So we've had almost 200 people killed and over 6,000 injured. And the injuries matter because what the UN report that was recently published also found is that the majority of live fire has been directed at lower limbs, causing in many cases permanent disabilities, things like amputations, spinal cord injuries. And so the injuries are really important because it means you're going to have essentially a generation of Gazans living their life in many cases with permanent disability. So the UN's report concluded that these shooting at live fire at unarmed protesters in this manner amounts to a war crime and perhaps a crime against humanity. And included in the killings are children, paramedics, journalists, disabled people. And I wanted to kind of relate, to give a little some sort of tell about some of those casualties if there's time. I don't know definitely. If you kind of. All right, so I just thought it's important because I want people to have a sense of what Gaza is like, and that it's a normal society. People do lots of different things, and they're people just like us, essentially. So here are 4 of the casualties and injuries that were documented by the UN. On 30th of March at about 9 a.m., Israeli forces shot Muhammad, 24 years old, who's a footballer, with a single bullet in both legs while he was walking about 150 metres from the separation fence. His injuries have ended his football career. On the 14th of May, Israeli forces shot Wisal, a 14-year-old girl, in the head when she was about 100 metres from the separation fence, after she'd approached a fence several times to hang a Palestinian flag there. She died instantly. On the 20th of June, Israeli forces fired a shot to the head of Yasser, who's an 11-year-old boy, as he was hiding with two friends behind a bin about 200 metres from the separation fence. The children had been chanting national slogans at Israeli forces. And on the 14th of May, Israeli snipers shot Fadi, a 29-year-old man who's a double amputee who had lost his legs in the 2014 bombing of Gaza. Fadi was shot in the chest where he was sitting in his wheelchair with two friends approximately 300 metres from the separation fence. He died immediately. So I just wanted to give a kind of flavour, as it were, of the sorts of shootings and killings that we're seeing in the course of these protests. And the use of live fire is basically ongoing. You know, there's been a kind of slight, there has been a decrease in the number of casualties, but the protest is still happening and the use of live fire is still happening. So that's kind of where we're at with the Gaza protests.
Yeah. So, Yair, as well, to move on to a different element of the conflict in Gaza. A couple of weeks ago, there was rockets from Gaza that went to Israel, and then Israel responded with a bombing campaign. Should we fear another war against Gaza? Should we fear another sustained bombing campaign?
I mean, it's always a possibility, but it looks like that's not where Netanyahu is going. I mean, if he wanted to, he could have done it this time. It seems like the aim is containment rather than another escalation. He's getting criticized for this from the opposition, which is supposed to be more moderate, but I think generally he's been pursuing some kind of limited understanding with Hamas rather than escalation. And I think the two main exceptions are, of course, the war in 2014, but also the demonstration in defense, where Israeli reaction was an escalation to previous dealings with these kind of situations. Yeah.
And I want to talk about the West Bank now as well, because we hear about Gaza a lot, because obviously that's where the most violent clashes take place. Israel likes to blame that on Hamas and says that everything's okay in the West Bank because they've elected a non-terrorist government. Can you describe what life's like in the West Bank? Is it better to be a Palestinian in the West Bank than in Gaza? Is it a different situation?
Yeah, well, the situation is definitely different, and I suppose you could call it better in certain respects. So, just to provide a bit of context, I know, so Gaza has been in the news a lot when there's a kind of flare-up of violence between armed groups in Israel, but what's not commonly in the news is the closure of Gaza. So Israel's imposed a closure on goods entering and leaving, and a blockade on air and sea and travel of people in and out. And that's been ongoing for about 11 years. And so the reason I'm saying it's worse at the moment to live in Gaza than in the West Bank is because this siege essentially means that 2 million people are imprisoned in a kind of open-air jail. And, the situation for Gazans has become really dire. So the UN predicts that by 2020, Gaza won't be livable. You've got power shortages. You've got 90% of Gaza's water is undrinkable. Almost 1 in 6 children are chronically malnourished because of the closure. People can't go in and out. So there are people who haven't left Gaza in years and years and years, haven't seen family who live just over in the West Bank. And there are people who've stuck outside of Gaza from there who can't return, and so on. So I think the situation in Gaza is worse in the sense that there's a much greater intensity of Israeli state violence, both in terms of bombardments, but also in terms of this siege. What you have in the West Bank is a situation that's ostensibly more open, so people can leave the West Bank and can re-enter it. But Israel's policy is to essentially colonize the West Bank. So you have Israeli settlements that fragment the territory. And what that means is, as a Palestinian, if you live, say, in one town, the town of Ramallah, and you want to try to travel an hour north to Nablus, you pass through checkpoints. There's massive swathes of the West Bank that are closed to Palestinians, so they can't actually go there. because those are areas that have been reserved for settlements or reserved for settlement expansion. You've got, ongoing violence by the settlers. Some of the settlers in the heart of the West Bank are very ideological and have been carrying out a campaign of settler violence against Palestinians for the last decade or so. And that results in weekly injuries, vandalism, destruction of property. And you have the Israeli army entering Palestinian towns and villages on a daily basis, carrying out arrests and raids. And so life is massively abnormal, essentially, for all Palestinians. If I would rather live in the West Bank, but that's only because Gaza's situation is exceptional, as unprecedented situation of, a 10-year-long siege. So
for the last decade, these policies that you've both been describing have been overseen by Benjamin Netanyahu. Next week, as I said in the introduction, there will be general elections in Israel. So I want to talk a bit later about how democracy in Israel or elections in Israel affect policy towards Palestine. But first of all, Yair, can you give kind of an introduction to Israeli electoral politics? So potentially start with Netanyahu. What is his legacy? Well, he might get re-elected, but what is his impact on Israeli politics? How should we assess Benjamin Netanyahu's premiership of Israel?
Okay, so Netanyahu is, on the one hand, very divisive. His equal citizens in at least in setting the course for the state. On the other hand, Netanyahu is relatively predictable. He's relatively cautious when it comes to using military force, compared, again, relatively in comparison to other Israeli Prime Minister. Ehud Olmert, for example, had 2 wars in 3 years. Netanyahu had 1 war in 10 years, so it gives you some kind of an idea.
And Olmert was from the Labour Party.
Olmert was originally from the Likud, but kind of went centre and kind of now is considered a leftist. And this was 2007, 2009. So he's relatively cautious. He's more reactive than taking. He's not one to take radical interventions unless he's really pushed to it, and that's the balance that with him you know more or less where you're going, while with other candidates from the right wing it would be less clear. So that's generally I would say his legacy.
And then the main opposition. So the main opposition is the Blue and White Party.
Yeah,
it's a new party.
So it's
set
new
up by generals, and is for the first time in a while seriously threatening Netanyahu's premiership.
Yeah, so this is a kind of centrist ad hoc coalition of forces. It's the Israeli establishment, deep state, if you want. It's the military's party in a way, because it has 3 former chiefs of staff at the forefront of the party. With various, so it kind of represents Israeli mainstream with combination of people that used to be from the Labour and people who used to be from the kind of softer right wing, although some of them have very clear links with the settlers, and they present a kind of centre right, really, I would say, and they have a chance of challenging him. That's the political map is very splintered in Israel. There's quite a lot of parties. It's kind of very confusing to see where it goes. But there is a block of parties that would go with Netanyahu anyway. And if they manage to get 50% of the Knesset, then he's fine. He will form another government, and there'll be another Likud government. If they don't get the 50%, then it gets interesting potentially.
Great. And then, so the opposition party, when I first started reading about this, it's often initially presented as the idea that Netanyahu, who's sort of painted as an extreme populist Trumpian, could get beaten by a centrist. So sort of like you initially read that headline and you think, oh, potentially a moderate is going to take over Israel. I was looking today at the various, I was looking up about this guy, Benny Gantz, who would be prime minister if they win. And in the launch of their video, in the launch of his presidential campaign, was a boast about how many Palestinians had been killed in the 2014 bombing campaign of Gaza. So it's like, this is supposed to be the moderate candidate. He was in charge of that war. So he was the chief of staff was he the chief of staff or the head of, I don't know.
The chief of staff.
The chief of staff
Yeah.
when Israel was bombing Gaza in 2014. I suppose for Palestinians have probably written off Israeli elections, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to have any real strong motivation as a Palestinian to follow Israeli domestic politics in a fine-grained manner because of the sense that there's a regime, in place in Israel. There's a settler colonial regime which in a structural way, constitutionally, discriminates against Palestinians and excludes them and dispossesses them. And so, in a sense, the government of the day doesn't really matter, so long as these state policies and the constitutional order is in place. Having said that, I mean, I think this perhaps is an interesting moment, because if you ask, I remember once speaking to a farmer in the West Bank who'd had, as most farmers have, had land confiscated by the Israeli authorities for a settlement. And he said, from his perspective, the difference between a Labour government and a Likud government wasn't about whether his land would be confiscated. It would either way. It would just be more about kind of almost the pace of that. Likud would be more aggressive, perhaps faster in doing it. Labour would do so more incrementally, but the result was the same. But at this moment, I understand there are some quite far-right parties which, because of the way Israeli sort of politics works, could potentially have a big influence if they become coalition partners. And I think that they're really, much further to the right than political parties we've seen in the past, who, I think one of them has a platform calling essentially for the transfer of Palestinians. Is that right? And do you see them as, just wondering what influence they might have?
Yeah, and they're very, very extreme right-wing people that, that's would be too extreme for Likud to have a government with in the past, but now they are going to be the coalition partners. I think that the reason this matters, there's first of all because we should think about the downside risks rather than the potential upside, because the potential upside of a Gantz victory is not considerable, but the downside risk of another Likud victory can be considerable. I think it's clear that the settlers, that the social base and the base of support of Netanyahu personally and his coalition is the settlers, and these Jewish supremacists within the settler groups. They feel that they have an opening with the Trump administration, that they can do whatever they want and there'll be no implications. So they are really itching for taking a radical step, like annexation of parts of the West Bank, maybe most of the West Bank, and even we can think about even worse scenarios that could happen in a moment of escalation. They sense that there is an opportunity here. Netanyahu is not someone that would go for this naturally, but A, he needs them, and B, he might be gone in a few months. There is a police investigation against him. He is charged with 3 or 4 cases of corruption. I don't think he can survive this. So I think if he wins, he will have to go within half a year. It's quite likely. And then the guy that is coming after him from the Likud is probably going to be much more accommodating towards the settlers and maybe take these kind of radical rights. And there we are in a very, very dangerous territory. And therefore, with blue and white, don't get your hopes up, but they will respond to pressure from the EU. They care about their international image in a way that I think Likud doesn't. I think, and the other thing which is interesting is that if they get a chance of government, that will be because of the Palestinian parties in the Knesset. That puts the Palestinian parties in a position that they haven't been really for 20 years, since the 90s. And that kind of awareness that road to power goes via working with the Palestinian parties, I think is now... I think it's, the centrist party are coming to terms with it. Now, how far can this work? I'm not sure, but it does give them a position to make demands and to be influential in a way that, they've been excluded systematically. The only time they were in coalition effectively was during the Rabin government in the 1990s, and then they had an effect.
What proportion of the Israeli citizens are of Palestinian origin?
20%.
20%.
Yeah.
And so, in a system of proportional representation, do they tend to get represented by 20% of the seats in the Knesset? The Knesset being the Israeli parliament.
No, it's more like 13%. There's less Palestinian citizens of Israel go to vote. Basically, a lot of them are disillusioned with the process because they're never in government. They never have any, they feel it's symbolic. So, I mean, but that's the kind of, if they get 15%, it's still significant. If they're not in the Knesset, it's a much more right-wing Knesset. And one of the things the right-wing want is to push them out of the Knesset.
I think this is a really interesting question about whether or not the Arab parties or the Palestinian parties who represent Palestinian citizens of Israel can ever have a real impact on Israeli policy. I think it's kind of important to understand sort of Israel's parliamentary democracy in a context here. So the way that I see it, and you might not agree, is that when Israel was established, the country, the land in which it was established, was actually majority Palestinian Arab, and Zionist militia expelled or otherwise caused to flee most Palestinians from the area that became what we would call Israel proper. And so you were left with a small minority of Palestinians. And for the first 20 years of Israel's establishment, from 1948 until 1966, those Palestinians were under military rule. So they were like the Palestinians that currently in the West Bank and Gaza are, but that was inside Israel. They were fragmented. Almost all of their land was taken from them by the state, and is now allotted by law only for Jewish use. They have a kind of whole series of laws that discriminate against them in all manner of life and all sectors of kind of life. And after 1966, I'm not sure when it was exactly that, so military rule ended, and I'm not sure at which point it was that they were able to form parliamentary parties and political parties and join parliament.
Throughout. So you have
throughout, okay.
Yeah, from 49, you have Palestinian representation.
Okay.
The
way, like I suppose Palestinians would view this is that it was possible, Israel could afford to extend citizenship to those Palestinians and allow them to participate in parliamentary democracy because they're a minority, so they never have any chance of actually governing the country. And because of the fact there are a whole set of laws and policies in place which are run in parallel to the parliamentary democracy that ensure the domination, essentially, of Israeli Jews over Palestinian Arabs. And then, so that's one aspect of it, right? So when you talk about whether or not the Arab Palestinian members of Knesset can have an influence, they can, but I think their influence is very circumscribed by the regime that's in place, which is one of essentially Jewish domination over Palestinians in all kinds of ways.
I mean, the way this relates to a question I asked you before we went on live, which was, obviously I introduced the show saying Israel calls itself the only democracy in the Middle East. I mean, there's another question about whether there are other democracies in the Middle East. There are other countries that hold elections. But do you see Israel as a democracy?
Personally, no, I don't. And the reason is I think it's sort of undeniable actually that it's not a democracy in the sort of sense of the word that we would be used to in Western Europe. So in addition to what I've just said about the fact that the state was formed by expelling a majority indigenous population and then holding a minority under military rule, let's also remember that from 1967 Israel has in effect expanded its borders, so it's gone on to occupy the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And whilst it keeps saying this is an occupation and this is temporary, in all manner of ways, it has in effect annexed those territories. And so what you actually have now in 2019 is a situation where all of the territory that was Mandate Palestine, historic Palestine, that's between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, is controlled by Israel. Israel is the sovereign in that. It exercises sovereignty over the whole territory. And you have almost 50% Palestinian Arab residents of the territory, 50% Israeli Jews. But the majority of Palestinians are disenfranchised completely, so they can't vote to the Israeli Knesset, even though the Israeli government controls their lives, and that's been the case for half a century. So if you understand Israel as a regime that controls the entire territory that it in fact controls, what you see is that the state serves essentially and represents only one of the ethnic groups over which it presides, and that's the Israeli Jewish group, and not the Palestinian Arab group, even though they're almost 50-50 in population terms. So that would be my main sort of argument as to why Israel can't be classed as a democracy.
What do you think about that particular question?
I think it's a hybrid regime. I think it's difficult to, since Israel exists for 71 years, 52 out of which it rules the West Bank and Gaza, and of course Gaza is a special situation since Israel pulled out, but still Israel has a lot of control over Gaza. That makes it difficult to argue that it's a temporary situation. And if you don't see it as a temporary situation, then you have a situation in which significant body of population does not have citizenship but is controlled. And that's difficult to call a democracy. So you have formal democracy within Israel proper and military rule and different kinds of variations, different in Jerusalem, different in West Bank, different in Gaza. Within Israel proper, it's a flawed democracy, but it's in some ways quite robust in terms of electoral process, in terms of judiciary. I mean, if the prime minister is going to go to prison, which he probably will, then that shows, it's something, the judiciary is quite strong in kind of, in that sense. So there are some robust elements there, but they're limited to a system within Israel proper, what we call rather the entire territory. So I think that is in that sense I agree with Salma. I think it's and within Israel I think we can theorize it in different ways, but certainly there's limits to the participation of the Palestinian minority.
And the way Salma described it, which is that you've got a population living on this piece of land, all of them controlled by one government, but only one subsection of that population able to vote for that government. That to me sounds like apartheid. So I suppose that's why people have called the Israel-Palestine conflict or Israel an apartheid regime. I don't know, do you think it's appropriate to classify that as a situation akin to apartheid?
I think in some ways rhetorically it's inevitable when you have a effectively permanent situation, people with different layers of citizenship. At the same time, I think there are significant problems with this that we should keep in mind, because if we just use it rhetorically, we hear this even from former prime ministers of Israel who use it rhetorically, like, look, we're becoming an apartheid state. So people get worked up about this, but this is being said in Israel by mainstream.
To warn against it.
Yes, yeah. Saying we need to resolve the situation. We need to get a Palestinian state, otherwise we will be apartheid forever. Same as there's significant differences. I mean, we are talking about, at least in international law, we're talking about military occupation. And there is a Palestinian demand for statehood, okay, so which didn't exist in South Africa. Nobody thought you could solve the South African situation by making a state for the black people. It was a unitary political unit. Here we don't have something that was officially a one unit. You have this kind of combination of things, and there's other when you talk about the labor market, significant differences between these cases. So I think if we want to use it more rigorously, then we have to come to terms with differences.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There are differences between Israel, Palestine, and South Africa. That doesn't necessarily, however, lead me to conclude that we can't characterize the situation in Israel as apartheid. But I just wanted to roll back for a second on the question of Israeli democracy. And just to say, I think, Yair is making a good point about the fact that there is a parliamentary democracy in so-called Israel proper, and it does function in many ways as a democracy. I think the difficulty is, I don't see this as a question of degree, sort of how good is Israel's democracy or not? You know, what checks and balances are there or aren't there? We can have a discussion about that and talk about whether or not it measures up to other liberal democracies or not. I think there's a bigger problem, which is what causes me to conclude that Israel is not a democracy, even if it had the most excellent parliamentary system. The question is, there isn't really. So when we talk about democracy, we're normally talking about civic kind of democracy in the West. There is this notion of the demos, which is the kind of political community of people who reside in the territory that is the sovereign territory of the state, and they are the citizens, and it is within them that sovereignty vests, and that's what the state sort of is constituted from, that political community, right, of residents within a territory. Now, I don't think there is this demos in Israel. What you have is, as I said, you have a state that controls a territory. Even if we were just to look at Israel proper now, let's forget the occupied territories. It is in fact part of Israeli law, and there's been a Israeli Supreme Court judgments on this that says there is no such thing as in Israeli law as the Israeli nation. So nation and citizenship are decoupled, which is unusual. So what they say is there is such a thing as the Jewish nation, and Israel is the state of the Jewish nation, and that's also written into law. And there are other national groups. So the Palestinian citizens of Israel have citizenship, and they have a certain number of rights, but they are not the national group that the state serves or that it believes itself to be constituted on behalf of. Actually, the state serves the Jewish nation, even those Jews who do not live in the territory of Israel. So world Jewry. I mean, this is according to Israeli law.
Is what you're describing related to the nation-state law, or is it something separate?
It is. There's a nation-state law, and even before the nation-state law, a bunch of laws and jurisprudence that make it clear that what there is an ethnos in a way. So there is an ethnic group that forms a political community that the state represents, which is not in alignment with the residents of the territory that the state controls. And that is the fundamental reason I say that Israel can't be classed as a democracy in the Western sense of the word. But rather, I would say there is some kind of writing that's been done and research about the concept of ethnocracy, which I think is a better description. I mean, I can go into we can talk about more of the laws and stuff. I don't know if that's interesting, but to people or...
Well, I want to move on to strategy at some point. If you have a response
I'll just
to
say that, I think that's true, and that's a basic problem. I think what I would say it's not a constant situation. So we do see, in the 90s, for example, we did see a movement towards a civic notion of Israeliness. And that is something, it's a potential that is there, but most of the time that's been, there's been a kind of an argument in Israel whether to go towards a civic model or whether to retain this model, which is more about ethnic and the ethnic wins most of the time, but the argument is there, and that's, in the 90s what we saw is that the ability of, because the government needed the Palestinian members of Knesset, it then started to change the rhetoric, then started to change the laws towards a more civic inclusion. And that was defeated by the end of the 90s. But in a way, what I would want to say is that it's not static. And the choice for the center-left in Israel, if it wants to get back to power, it needs the Palestinian votes. And it has to come to terms. That would mean also changing a lot of the character of or the constitutional makeup of the state.
I want to park that question of ethnic civic nationalism for a moment when we talk about Zionism and anti-Zionism. First of all, you're watching Tiski Sour. As you know, Novara Media is only possible because of your kind donations. So if you're already a subscriber, thank you. You're what makes this possible. You are the reason Novara Media can grow, and we can continue making these shows, make them more often, make them better, make them so that the feed doesn't crash when we go live initially. You'll only see me do an introduction once, in maybe about 5 years' time, probably. If you don't already subscribe, please go to support.novaramedia.com. Our ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, so we can continue working around the clock. I have my laptop closed, so I don't know how many of you are watching, but what I do know is I want more people to be watching this. So make sure you like the video. That means it appears in more people's news feeds. Make sure you subscribe to Novara Media and make sure your notifications are on so you know anytime we go live. And of course, share this on Facebook, share this on Twitter, email it to your family. so we can keep getting bigger. I want to talk about strategy now. So for as long as there has been an occupation of the Palestinian territories, there has been debate about how to resist it. What's the best strategy to do that? The first thing I want to talk about is whether or not that can be in alliance with an Israeli left, and whether or not there is an Israeli left. So I suppose that's for you,
Yair. In terms of parties, very little of it. I mean, there's the Palestinian parties, some of them are leftist, I would say, the communists, etc. There's a small party, Meretz, and part of the Labour Party, some of the people there can be described as left. It's a very small section in the Knesset. Most of the Knesset is, in European terms, would be between centre and extreme right. Most of the Knesset, I think, where, if we're kind of broadly speaking. However, that doesn't mean that the potential isn't there. I think a lot of the messages do filter down and people are aware, and so change is possible. It's a question of circumstances and context, but it's not it's not set of stone. It's in stone in that sense.
And so the other sort of strategy that can force, or the idea is it can force the Israeli government to change its policies, is external pressure. So be that sort of state sanctions, or of course, BDS is at the moment the leading or the most famous tool of resistance to the Israeli state. Do you think BDS is being proven to be effective in any way? BDS being boycott, divest, sanctions.
Yeah, I think.
Is it the best we've got, I suppose?
I think in sort of trying to answer this question about strategy, it's important to grapple with the seriousness of the situation from the Palestinian perspective, which I'm not sure if that has come across completely. So put yourself in Palestinian shoes, and there is really a current live ethnic cleansing campaign happening against Palestinians all over the territory of Israel, Palestine, definitely in the West Bank, but also in Israel proper. We have Bedouins from the Negev Desert being displaced in order to Judaize that area, and that's Israeli government terminology. And the same in the Galilee. We have Palestinians in the Gaza Strip literally probably on the brink of one of the worst man-made humanitarian catastrophes of modern times. And we have this encroaching, creeping annexation in the West Bank that's making life unbearable. It's making Palestinians leave. So from a Palestinian point of view, we are facing a daily violent onslaught. And the question has become so critical, especially with the move to the right in Israel. The question for Palestinians has become it's just how do we survive? How do we actually hold on? And then hopefully be in a position at some point to struggle for and achieve our rights. At the moment, it's just a question of trying to stop sort of national kind of annihilation. And in that context, I think, the Israeli left, unfortunately, and I think, Yair has kind of pointed to this, is very weak, it's very feeble. We would need a really much stronger left that was really in solidarity with the Palestinians, that understood the issues properly to partner with. I think in the absence of that, I still think, by the way, that ultimately I would hope and I would imagine this problem can only be solved by collaboration between Palestinians and sections of Israeli society that are serious about seeing regime change in Israel. Not change in a few policies of the government, but change in regime to ones that stops
what do you mean by regime
suppressing the Palestinians. Well, I think regime change, I do think the state needs to be reformulated on universalist principles, on principles where it says it reconstituted as a state of all its citizens, so that it can then deal in equality, and it can right some of the historic injustices, and it can also stop this process of colonization of the land, which is happening. I don't see any other way, because the colonies that Israel creates in the West Bank, so the settlement enterprise that's stopping there being a Palestinian state, is inextricably tied up with the Israeli regime within Israel proper. It's the same regime, it's the same state, it's the same governments that are doing that. So to my mind, there needs to be a regime change in the sense of, instead of being an ethnocratic state, a state of all its citizens. And how do we achieve that is the next question. And I'm sorry, I know this has been a very long answer.
No.
But I think the first point will be, in the long term, there needs to be partnering between different constituencies within Israel and Palestine to achieve this. But in the shorter term, yes, I think some kind of international pressure is probably needed. Boycotts, divestment, sanctions, popular pressure from outside, but also sanctions by governments if that were ever possible. Because the reason Israel does what it does is because it can. Okay, it's armed and it's financed and it's supported by the West, and that's why it can do this. It wouldn't be able to otherwise.
I mean, in terms of international sanctions, that brings us potentially to the first really pro-Palestine leader of the Labour Party and potentially Prime Minister at some point. I mean, I think he personally would probably quite like to impose sanctions on Israel. Whether or not that's going to be possible is unknown. But that sort of, I think it'd be useful to discuss how the Labour Party is dealing with the question of Israel and Palestine. It's obviously tying itself in many knots doing so. And first of all, I want to talk about Zionism. Right, so your last two contributions have definitely been touching on the question of Zionism and anti-Zionism. This is a huge raging debate within the Labour Party at this point. So I'll start with you, Yair. Do you think the left is caught up in a debate of Zionism and anti-Zionism, or do you think that it is an essential question basically for the equal rights and liberation of Palestinians?
Yes, I think it's an unhelpful discussion. I think it's sending people in the wrong direction, and it actually makes it more difficult to deal with the realities now, or even say the recent decades. I mean, I'm in minority here. I think most people still use these categories kind of very emotionally as if they mean things, Zionist or anti-Zionist. People are very invested in these terms. There's a few things to note. First of all, we should note that the term Zionist is used as a kind of, instead of saying a Jew. A lot of time people think that they can get away with saying anti-Semitic stuff is by saying Zionist instead of Jew. And that's one thing to be kind of cautious about. The second thing, as a kind of, I think, giving too much power to explanatory power to ideology, for me it's wrong. That's not, I'm a historian, that's not how I think. I think Zionism is a product rather than as a driver of history. It's a product of early 20th century Europe, and what happens afterwards in Israel-Palestine is a product of various things. I don't think it's helpful to think of it as some kind of, people have their book of ideology and then they do what's written in there. Lastly, I would say that when we say Zionism, is Zionism, legit or not? I think that sends us to starting discussion. What is Zionism? How do we define it, etc.? And people start getting worked up about stuff. Most of it happened a century ago. Okay, and does historically Zionism have justification or not? And that's not very helpful to discuss the current situation. I think it's because the situation in Europe 1900 or even Palestine 47 is not the situation we have today. So we have to, I think it's a more useful way to ask whether you're Zionist or not, because the way some people understand it as a national identification or sense of connection to, the historical land of Israel. And some people understand it as the experience of being dispossessed by something that came from outside and took their land. That's the Palestinians. So in a way, and both sides are talking across each other. I think more useful to say, what do you think about the land regime? What do you think about discriminatory allocation of land according to ethnicity? What do you think about the fact that 20% minority does not get national rights in Israel? That's a kind of more relevant question. What do you think about annexation of the West Bank, creeping annexation of the West Bank? And these are questions that I think that we can find a much, much wider common denominator than if we start talking about Zionism 100 years ago.
Salma?
Do
you think the left should be anti-Zionist, I suppose, is one way of framing that? Is it essential for the left to be anti-Zionist?
So is this a question about our domestic politics here, or something more generally about how we talk about Israel-Palestine?
Well, I suppose the context is that in the UK there is a debate between leftists who want to delegitimize Zionism as a ideology, but also as a commitment. So there is the idea that if someone is Zionists, they subscribe to basically ethnic nationalism and racism. So many people will say Zionism is racism, and there's a convincing argument that that's the case. If you see it as a form of ethnic nationalism that discriminates against Palestinians because they are Palestinian, or Arabs because they are Arabs, then it would seem like something that a universalist left should oppose.
Right.
Or do you think we should park the question of Zionism and anti-Zionism because it ultimately distracts from the short-term issues at hand, or even the long-term issues at hand, because it divides people and alienates people who could be allies in the movement for Palestinian human rights?
Well, so I think in a way there are two separate questions. The one about whether the left in this country should be bogged down in taking positions on Zionism or anti-Zionism. I agree there's a kind of compelling argument that is sort of a waste of energy, because the real issue is, well, for a start, I don't see that the left needs to take particularly a position on whether or not we agree with the idea of ethnic nationalism. Because if they were to do that vis-a-vis Jewish ethnic nationalism, which is Zionism, they'd have to do that vis-a-vis lots of other ethnic nationalisms around the world, which they're not. So, in a sense, there is I kind of agree with Yair's point about there being a discussion that's very abstract and is not necessary to be had. It's better to look at the actual policies. Having said that, where I would probably disagree with what's been said is that if you're talking not just sort of about discussions within the left, but if you're talking about a proper kind of critique and analysis of Israel-Palestine, it's difficult to get away from dealing with the question of Zionism, political Zionism as it is today. Yair said there's something that arose 100 years ago, and why are we kind of in the past? The problem is it's not the past. So Israeli governments of all colours, profess regularly that they are Zionist and demonstrate their Zionist credentials. You have Zionist organizations, so the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Agency, these are organizations that define themselves as having Zionist objectives, having a quasi-state kind of status in Israel. So, in other words, Israel's constitution is set up to ensure that extraterritorial Zionist organizations have governmental functions in Israel through, for example, ensuring immigration of Jews to Israel, how they allocate land, how they ensure development of land for Jews, etc. So, in other words, you can't really get away, I think, from the idea that Israel defines itself as a Zionist regime. And that has consequences for Palestinians, which are being felt today. They're not being felt 100 years ago.
So, but just before you respond to that, I'm going to start taking your questions. So write them down. I'll be collecting them as you respond to Salma.
Okay, so I think clearly history hasn't stopped, and I think if Zionism means the kind of model that we have today in Israel-Palestine, then I can understand this. But I think a lot of people don't understand it necessarily this way. And when, especially diaspora Jews, who feel that they have a sense of connection and a sense of identification with Israel, and when you put them on the spot and you say, now say if you're Zionist or anti-Zionist, then they're going to fall on the Zionist side. But I think that's, for me, it's a less important question. I think the question is, do you agree to this kind of model of constitution? Is this what you have in mind? And there I would see we would see more of a divergence. And I would say that also, we all understand that what socialism means today is not what it meant 100 years ago. And what feminism means today is not what it meant 100 years ago. So these things change according to context. And in a way, part of the problem of the discussion of Zionism that I see is that people assume that there's an unchanging ideology that works, rigorously. And I don't think it's the case. I think it's more, as I said, product of the historical age. Currently, we live in a historical age where we see the rise of neo-fascism, And the kind of things that are possible today is not what, used to be possible in the 90s. I mean, in the 90s, Netanyahu was shaking Arafat's hand and talking about Oslo, etc.
Whilst accelerating settlement
yeah.
expansion in the West Bank.
But much more cautiously.
Yeah.
I think at the moment we're in where things are much more risky as a result of that. And that has maybe something to do with the fact that Israel never gave up this settlement drive, and the idea that Israel has to settle, that establishing Jewish settlements is a project that the state is invested in. That's part of it, but also it's a global context and what it allows and what it legitimizes. And that's kind of, I think, we get lost when we talk about ideologies.
All right, I've got loads of really good questions, so I want fairly quick fire answers.
Okay, can I not come back on that quickly or not?
Quickly, yeah, go on.
It's just to say, I don't know maybe if we're using the same definition. I'm talking about political Zionism as having quite a tightly defined definition, which is basically the notion that Jews are entitled to a nation state in all or part of historic Palestine, and that means having an ethnically majority or at least purely Jewish state, which privileges Jews above all other groups. Now that has consequences. That is a political ideology which currently underlines the state of Israel, that underlines the Zionist organizations that have governmental functions in Israel. That is their explicit mandate, which they call Zionism. And that's what I'm talking about. I know that there's all kinds of other forms of what Zionism means at the individual level. Does it mean a kind of attachment or a nostalgia and all of that? We're not talking about that as Palestinians. We're talking about a specific political project. It's tightly and clearly defined by Israeli state institutions themselves. And it is the cause of our suffering. So we have to address it one way or the other.
Should we go to questions? Yeah? Quick fire, this is for you, Salma. Classic Jag lover asks, can there still be a Palestinian state? Is there anywhere for it to actually be?
Not really. You said quick fire.
Quick fire, yeah, but you can expand if you want.
Well, the majority of the territory of the West Bank has been gobbled up by settlements, unless there's a major evacuation of a large number of settlers, which would really need to be in the hundreds of thousands to make it viable. Then a Palestinian state isn't viable because its territory is totally fragmented and it has no control over its natural resources, such as water aquifers or the Jordan Valley, which borders Jordan. And so unless there was a major evacuation, which doesn't look like it's on the cards, then there doesn't seem to be at the moment a territory for a viable state.
Yair, does that mean a two-state solution is dead?
Yeah, I think it's not really a viable route. I mean, it's extremely unlikely, let's put it this way. So we're in the kind of stuck in the, one model is dead, but we don't have alternative model instead.
Darren Alevi asks, who is the most left-wing politician in Israeli politics?
I would go for Ayman Odeh, the head of the list, one of the Palestinian lists. He's a good communist guy.
And he's Palestinian.
Yes.
How do you say that? So the person can Google it. What was the name?
Ayman Odeh.
Ayman Odeh.
Yeah. He's a good progressive, except on Syria, where I would like him to take a stronger anti-regime line, but generally speaking, he's a good progressive guy.
Salma from Thomas Thompson, what can a Labour government do, not what it shouldn't do or what's happening? What should Labour's policy be on Israel?
What should its policy be?
Yeah. The question had a few caveats, but what should Labour's policy be on Israel?
Well, I believe...
On Israel-Palestine.
Okay, so I think the policy should be kind of commensurate with and appropriate to the policy of a third state government. So, the UK is not in a position to come and actually solve the conflict directly or tell the Israelis and Palestinians what to do, but it can create conditions that are conducive to achieving a just settlement of the issue. And I think at the moment, the main driver of conflict is Israel's relentless colonization drive, which it can only carry out because it's supported by the West, because it has political cover, and because it faces no accountability for its actions. So I think UK policy should be geared towards, one, ensuring that there's some sort of consequence for Israeli actions. So that could be through sanctions, that could be through international isolation. Two, there needs to be accountability for Israeli actions. So I think there should be a genuine attempt to get a prosecution at the international level or something like that. And I think that would help. I know everyone's going to say, oh my God, that's terrible and that's demonizing Israel. But we have to get real about the dynamics of this conflict. You're not going to stop violations from happening when an actor is very powerful unless it feels there's some cost to it carrying out those violations and it's not perversely receiving any benefits from them. So UK foreign policy needs to create those conditions.
I'm not sure many of our audience will think that's so terrible.
Really? Okay, I don't know. I think
Well, I want to say, also to explain where the Israeli electorate is, of course, they understand the failure of the process in other ways. I mean, they would, if you ask for the average Israeli, they would talk about the collapse of Oslo, they would talk about suicide bombings, they would point to the split between Gaza and the West Bank and say, who are you going to talk with? Because even the Palestinians are fragmented. And they would talk about, what if, you have a Palestinian state in the West Bank, what if ISIS takes over? Even there's no support for ISIS among Palestinians, but I mean, these are kind of concerns. And especially so when the sense of risk, and there is a real risk, and there is risk also of internal conflict within Israeli society if they go towards, but there's no clear gain out of the process. It seems very limited gain in the short term. And there's no price for Israeli control at the moment. That we're stuck in a situation where Israelis, in a rational way, have no incentive to move forward. Even if they understand the occupation is really bad for Israel, a lot of them understand it. They just don't see a way out.
But I mean, that's Salma's point, right? To say that if there is never going to be, or if it doesn't, we can't envision any kind of successful movement within Israel which gives a shit about Palestinian rights, then the international community is going to have to make that decision hurt the Israelis. It's not so much can we persuade you to have a two-state solution or can we persuade you to give Palestinians equal rights. It's we put sanctions on your economy and therefore that should hopefully persuade them or force them or incentivize them to take a different stance towards Palestinians.
I mean, in the 90s, what we saw that Israel had something to gain from the process and had something to lose if it didn't go. I think we're not in that situation either way. I don't see the chance for sanctions is, frankly speaking, zero in the next 10 years. Let's be realistic about that. And the question, and the dangerous years are the next 2 years, or as long as Trump is in office. So I think you have to think, what do you do, if there is an escalation, if there's a serious, if there's a real attempt to, say, expel some parts of the West Bank, as some settlers would want. Yeah. I think that's the kind of question, rather than, sanction, maybe in 10 years, maybe not ever. But I think we have to think more short term.
Joseph O., what are the historical or material reasons for the weakness of the Israeli left?
That's a good question.
I think there's the Israeli left was not able to transcend certain things about, so this separatist model, which is very important in the history of Zionism and Israel. And although there were attempts, but this separatist model was very, very strong, and it wasn't able to go beyond that when Oslo collapsed. I think that also settlement, the idea that settlement has to stop, that settlement, a form of colonization, has to end, and coming to terms with this historically is something that Israeli left has not yet reached that point. And lastly, I think that we should say that Oslo was a very neoliberal process. A lot of the Israelis didn't see any gain from it and felt that they were losing out, and you have the Israeli elite which benefited very much, but a lot of low class and Mizrahi Jews who came from Arab countries who were very much against this process, and that is a kind of model that couldn't work.
Final question. It's going to go to you as a barrister. Everyone can comment, of course. This is from Gillian Roebuck. Do you envisage a time when a Court of Human Rights Truth and Reconciliation Centre, or process I suppose, will investigate the crimes of the State of Israel in the same way that we have for Yugoslavia and Rwanda?
This is the point. I think you would need a mechanism like that, but I think that realistically, a kind of either Truth and Reconciliation Commission, kind of like the South African model, or these tribunals that actually prosecuted perpetrators, as in Rwanda and Yugoslavia. That mechanism is realistically only going to be the outcome of a process of, I believe, what is required to have genuinely solve this issue is regime change in Israel. So a decolonization of the Israeli state. Because the settlement enterprise, people need to, I really want, if people have one message from this, the settlement enterprise in the West Bank is an extension of Israeli policy within the Green Line. Massive land appropriation happened within the Green Line.
What's the Green Line, sorry?
So within the territory that Israel captured in 1948, the part of historic Palestine captured then, Palestinians had their land taken from them, they were expelled, Jewish settlements were created on that land, and using the exact same mechanisms and very similar laws, that project was then expanded into the West Bank when Israel captured it in 1967. So the driver of this conflict, the driver of this behavior is this form of constitutional order in Israel, which is expansionist, which seeks Israeli Jewish domination at the expense of the Palestinians. That has to be reversed in order for us to see truly a just solution. And commissions like the type that the question raised are realistically only going to be an outcome of that process, because before then there won't be the appetite or the possibility really of prosecutions.
That gives a lot of impetus for a final point from you.
I would say yes. I mean, I think yes, I agree that it should be outcome. I think one of the problems here, that if we compare it to other colonial situations, we do have two national communities here, and that's an unprecedented, I think, situation. And the idea of how to address this and how to overcome separatism, which I think is part of the issue, because any kind of future has to be joined, has to be, in any kind of political solution, whether 2 states or 1 state, you have to reach a situation where there's a joint model where rights are equal, although that can have various models. And that is, to get to that in a situation where there's deep separation of the economies, of the populations, that's a real challenge.
Okay. You're bursting to...
No, I would say there is separation on a mental level, but I would just challenge that fact concretely on the ground. There isn't separation. Israel has completely incorporated the West Bank infrastructurally in every possible way into its own territory. So actually everyone is intermingled now.
But
not. Do you see what I mean?
But the labour market is much less.
Yeah.
Unlike the 70s and 80s.
You're right. That's a consequence of Oslo. You're right. Yeah.
All right, so we end on an agreement. Thank you, Yair Wallach. Thank you, Salma, Karmi-Ayyoub. I've learned a lot from that discussion. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your excellent questions. As always, if you want to make Novara Media expand, if you want to help us grow, please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you already do, thank you. You're what makes this possible. Please like and share this video. And we'll see you next week. It'll probably be on something to do with the British government breaking down. I can't guarantee what will have been announced by then. So see you then. Good night.